All set. Please don't take screenshots of today's discussion, and thank you so much for your cooperation. I'd like to turn it over now to Keith to further introduce our guest speaker and then to jump into leading what is sure to be an insightful discussion on the future of the U.S. and Northeast Asia. Over to you, Keith.
Thanks, Seth. And as we begin this evening, I would like to express thanks to my colleagues, Seth Joyner, Marissa McPherson, Yuri M., who have been very helpful in preparing for this event. We are especially delighted to have Michelle with us, Michelle Ye Hee Lee, a journalist who is with the Washington Post. She is the Tokyo Bureau Chief, reporting on Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Previously, she covered money and influence in politics and voting access on the National Political Enterprise and Accountability Team, and was a reporter for the Post fact checker. And I will tell you, Michelle, when I read that, I had to go through all my notes to make certain that I'm accurate this evening. Prior to joining the Post in 2014, she was a government accountability reporter at the Arizona Republic in Phoenix. Michelle, before we get into the topic at hand, in preparing for tonight, once again, I came across an article that you wrote 6 years ago about your family and your family's connection to the peninsula. Could you please share with the audience some of your own background and perspective in that regard?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you so much to NCNK and to you, Keith, for having me. It's a real honor to be here and have a chance to have a conversation with you. I was actually born in Seoul, and I immigrated to Guam with my parents when I was 6. So I grew up in Guam, an American territory. I went to college in the mainland US, and my parents actually still live in Guam. So I very much consider myself a 1.5 generation Korean American. I'm the first Asian American to have this job for the Washington Post, to be covering Tokyo and the Korean Peninsula. And I do have a personal connection in that, my whole family comes from the Korean Peninsula. My mom's side of the family is from the north, and my dad's side is from the south. My maternal grandparents came down from Pyongyang to Seoul right before the Korean War. They resettled in Seoul, and some of my grandpa's family never made it out. So when we talk about, divided families, that's very much my family as well. My dad's side of the family is from Busan, and Ulsan area, so the southernmost part of the South Korea. My dad's grandfather was an independence activist who fought for Korean freedom from the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. After that, my grandfather and my father, like their whole family, had to actually move from Ulsan to Busan because my great grandfather was targeted by law enforcement after he was imprisoned due to his independence activism activities. And my dad's aunt was actually one of the young teen brides who got married early because she was afraid of becoming one of the comfort women, the wartime sex slaves. And so very much the history of the peninsula and the region is woven into my family, which I think brings a bit more texture and a little bit of more context and a more personal sense to me as I report stories and do my job.
Well, thanks, Michelle. That's very helpful background for us to have, especially on the context front, as you mentioned. Michelle, elections have consequences. And so we would now like to receive your take on U.S., Northeast Asia. What are the prospects? What are the possibilities? Give us an overview from your angle.
Yes, of course. I know we have a lot to discuss, so I'm going to keep some of the presentation right now on big picture thoughts, and then I look forward to having a more detailed discussion with you. As you mentioned, I cover Japan and the Korean Peninsula and sometimes the Northeast Asia region more broadly. And I split my time between Seoul and Tokyo. Right now I'm in Seoul. And, I wanted to lay out some points in terms of the challenges and opportunities of Trump 2.0 in regards to this region, and in particular, the countries that I cover. I started this role in 2021, shortly after President Biden took office. And the first thing I heard from Japanese and South Korean officials was, is President Trump coming back? Is America First gone? Was it a temporary thing, or is it on hiatus? Is it coming back? And I think now we know the answer. The return of Donald Trump, which signifies a return to America First foreign policy, which is something that was very much on top of the minds of the allied countries' officials. And the biggest thing that the return of Trump really signals to them is that it affirms in many allies and partners the idea that the US is no longer a reliable actor and that they need to hedge and make their own partnerships independent of their relationship with the US. We saw that happening under the Trump first term and under President Biden. For example, when Japan began building relations with the Philippines and with Germany and even with the UK, building their own defense deals and having their own separate exercises. And I think this could also be an opportunity for the allies to continue pursuing in a second Trump term. For the past 4 years, the Biden administration has been building its so-called lattice work of minilateral relations throughout the Asia Pacific, from the Quad to US-Japan ROK, US-Japan Philippines. But there was always this underlying sense of, what happens if Trump comes back? And zooming in, the return of President Trump has put several issues back on the table for allies in this region. Specifically, when it comes to South Korea, for months I've been hearing from officials questions about a range of things on their mind. Whether President Trump will try to renegotiate the SMA and demand more money from Seoul for hosting troops, whether he'll actually pull troops from the peninsula, whether the joint military drills will continue, whether President Yoon will be able to build a personal rapport with President Trump, similar to former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. What happens with US-North Korea relations? Will President Trump try to re-engage Kim Jong-un in talks? And what role would South Korea play then, especially under a conservative President Yoon? And what happens with the trilateral relations with US-Japan ROK? And similarly in Japan, these issues have been on top of mind, starting with the trilateral relations and also with the potential demand and increase of GDP, increase of defense spending, which Japan already increased a couple of years ago, but President Trump could demand more. He could demand more in annual funding for the troops as well. Whether there might be pressures to revise the security treaty in a way that might be more favorable to the US. And questions for both countries about the potential impact of tariffs. Trump has already said that he wants to impose 10 to 20% tariffs across the board and up to 60% for imports from China. And what will this mean for trade and investment relationships for both allied countries? But I think some of the other complicating matters out here are the domestic politics in both Japan and South Korea. In Japan, it's really unclear how long Prime Minister Ishiba will stay. He was recently elected in October and then reaffirmed in November, but the LDP remains deeply unpopular. He came in as a reform candidate, but he has struggled so far to show that he truly can push for reform and show his ability to do so within the Japanese bureaucracy. And his party lost majority in the parliament for the first time in a very long time in the lower house elections recently, and he's now leading a minority government. So it's this political instability in Japan is not only unusual of Japan, but especially a big change given the steady presence that Prime Minister Kishida had built, at least outward-facing presence that he had built as a foreign leader, as an ally of the US, as a steadfast G7 member. And under this minority government, it's unclear how Japan will move forward on its defense spending, defense matters, the backfilling of US supplies that are being sent to Ukraine, etc. And similarly in South Korea, President Yoon's popularity is very low. Last week it reached, I believe, a record low of 17%. This week, I think it bounced up to about 20%. And these domestic political scandals that President Yoon has been facing have been really hamstringing his agenda. And it makes him even more vulnerable to some of these issues that President Trump is likely to bring up, like troop withdrawals and SMA negotiations, which are very politicized in South Korea and an easy cudgel for the Democrats to wield against him in domestic debates and domestic political fights. Then, of course, the massive looming question is, what about North Korea? At the moment, North Korea military cooperation with Russia is very much on top of many of our minds, and President Trump has been saying that he would resolve the Russia-Ukraine war within 24 hours. Of course, that's likely hyperbole, but what will those negotiations look like? Where does North Korea fit into that? What happens next after these long-range missiles that have just been launched? Will North Korea respond? Whether North Korea will send even more troops over, and what would be the implications of that on the war and on North Korea-Russia relations, are all major questions that we have right now. Since President Trump left office, North Korea's nuclear and weapons capabilities have grown. Recently, North Korea showed off its uranium enrichment facility, revealed it for the first time. We know Kim Jong-un is in the midst of a 5-year military development plan. He recently launched a new ICBM that flew the longest ever time and farthest ever distance on a lofted trajectory. And we know there are other things that Kim Jong-un wants within his military wish list, and those are underway, which raises a question of whether North Korea would be interested in denuclearization talks again with a second Trump term, or whether he would be wanting something more like an arms control talk, or the removal of U.S. troops from the peninsula, or an end to the joint military drills between U.S. and ROK. Last time, President Trump first pressured Kim Jong-un with fire and fury, as we all remember. Then there were the insults of the dotard and the little rocket man. And then President Trump pivoted to love letters and began the negotiations. But it's unclear whether that same tactic will resurface or whether it will work again. I think we really have to see what happens to the Russia-DPRK relationships, which is at the moment, the two leaders, Putin and Kim Jong-un, really insist is very comprehensive, that it's not just military, but it's also economic and within the cultural exchange between the two countries. And we don't know what North Korea is getting in return, but the consensus among experts seems to be that Kim finds it so worthwhile that it's worth sending his weapons and some of his troops even over to Russia. But I do think that North Korea is a place that we have probably the greatest opportunity for engagement, because it's a Trump presidency. Some people refer to the Biden era North Korea policy as an extension of Obama strategic patience, as strategic patience 2.0. And many analysts that I've talked to over the years believe that there was no good faith, serious effort to engage DPRK in talks, as in no serious indication that sanctions relief would be back on the table, which is what we know Kim wants. And there was a sense leading up to the election that if Kamala Harris is elected, that it would likely have continued this approach, been an extension of the Biden era approach to North Korea, by strengthening relations with allies to deter North Korea and take a more hardline approach rather than engaging in serious efforts to renegotiate. But of course, it's not clear if North Korea will engage in a second Trump term or when. His military development plan runs to 2026, and North Korea should be holding its next party Congress in 2026, which could be an opportunity. But what the catalyst for engagement would be, I think that's a big question that none of us can answer yet. But I do think that under a Trump presidency, many things can be back on the table now. We know that this is an issue that Trump thinks about and cares about politically, and he's talked about it as recently as his acceptance speech at the GOP convention. He mentioned Kim Jong-un during his speech. And I think there are some opportunities that can open up during the Trump second term, although there's still a question of whether those opportunities and those engagements could come up with any tangible results. I think that's a separate matter than whether engagement will happen with North Korea under a second Trump term. So I think those are some of the main friction points and opportunities facing both allies, or all three countries. I think the final point I'll make quickly is that President Trump has already made it clear that he will be stacking his administration with anti-China hardliners. And we expect him to take a tough stance on China, both economically and politically. And I think that could also create some frictions as well as some opportunities for the allies. Um, Japan and South Korea also want to decrease their supply chain dependence on China, but they can't really yet because they do depend so much on China economically, and their major industries have a lot of interest in maintaining their business in China. But at the same time, I think it could create a lot of friction for both Japan and South Korea, depending on how President Trump approaches his relations with allies as he tries to confront China. So I think that's just the final point I'll make, and I'll stop here because I've been talking for a while, and I look forward to the discussion.
Well, Michelle, an excellent overview. We could be asking questions of you based on your overview until midnight. We won't do that. But in no particular order, I do have a few questions to follow up specifically to your presentation. One relates to Hanoi, to the failed Hanoi summit. As the world knows, Kim Jong-un returned to Pyongyang dissatisfied. Some insist that he was humiliated by the failed Hanoi summit. After that summit, any track one, any government-to-government talks between the U.S. and DPRK no longer existed. Track two talks no longer existed. No, and of course, the border shutdown comes in here as well in terms of COVID, et cetera. But partly due to Hanoi, it seems that North Korea stopped receiving humanitarian assistance from the United States, from U.S. NGOs and others. There are reports that the leader was so upset that some of those around him who had helped plan the Hanoi summit faced some very serious consequences upon returning home. But I really don't want to get into an autopsy of the total outcome. However, in your mind, based upon your sources, based upon the research you've conducted, to what degree does Kim Jong-un place blame for the outcome of Hanoi on President Trump, or does he largely place blame with others outside of the United States who may have provided him information in advance of the summit, leading him to believe that the details of the meeting and or the outcome would be other than what occurred? Any thoughts on that?
Well, of course, it would be a futile exercise to predict what Kim Jong-un thinks. But based on the experts I've spoken with over the years, especially those who have been involved in those talks in Hanoi and leading up to and afterward, there is a lot of focus on what role former President Moon Jae-in played, what sort of information he was shuttling in between the two other countries. And we had seen Kim Jong-un react somewhat along those lines after Hanoi, cutting off inter-Korean ties, blowing up the liaison office, etc. And I think that's part of the reason why there's a lot of question now in South Korea about what happens this time around if President Trump tries to talk to North Korea again. What role will President Yoon play? What lessons have been learned from the first time? What makes sense for him given his current hardline approach to North Korea? And I think that's very much on the minds of South Korean officials because of Hanoi. And in the, some of those autopsies that have been done after Hanoi, I think a lot of the focus has been on what role South Korea and its officials played during that time.
Well, as you noted in your presentation, you had excellent questions, but no one really knows what the future holds in terms of the Trump administration's approach to the region. It will take the new administration some time to identify the key people, to develop a policy, et cetera. However, again, going back to your comments, during the past 4 years, as you noted, the Biden administration has heavily invested in developing stronger ties among the U.S., Japan, South Korea. In recent days, leaders of the three countries announced the establishment of a trilateral cooperation summit, perhaps an effort to enshrine gains made in trilateral cooperation in recent years. Once President Biden departs, how fragile how fragile will the remaining structure be? I say that in part, given the fact that for the past 30 years or so, Japan and North Korea have had a series of talks. Tony Namkong is someone who's been involved behind the scenes with some of those. And it seems to me that there have been at least 3 rounds of talks between North Korea and Japan in the 2023 to 2024 timeframe. If there's a fracture in the U.S.-Japan ROK relationship, or if there's a deterioration of ROK-Japan relations, this perhaps could lead to renewed talks between Japan and North Korea, even though there are key issues to both countries that are significant. The abductee issue for the Japanese, and then for North Korea, one of the issues likely is comfort women as well. But what do you see happening once Biden is gone and Japan and Korea pull back, they reflect on realities? Do you see the possibility of Japan pursuing a more aggressive effort to work out some sort of agreement with North Korea?
Well, in terms of Japan-North Korea relations, we do know that the diplomats from both sides had been meeting a couple times, as you mentioned, and Prime Minister Kishida recently had been invoking the meeting with Kim Jong-un, but it was often politically timed, like during a time when he was sort of struggling in the polls, bringing back up the abductee issue, which is very much an issue that the Japanese public cares about and wants to see a resolution to. But every time those talks seem to kind of move forward a little bit, we saw that coming to a halt because of some of these preconditions that were coming from the North Korean side that Kishida would not cross. One being the abductee issue. I believe it was Kim Yo-jong who said that, we're open to a relationship with Japan and talking and continuing that as long as we decide that the abductee issue is resolved. And then there was a second condition that, the issue of North Korea nuclear weapons would be accepted. And those are two things that Prime Minister Kishida was not going to do. And so those talks halted and they said, okay, let's maybe pick this back up another time. But I do think, during a time of political convenience or political gain for both sides, it could be something that could be restarted. Of course, we'll have to see how Prime Minister Ishiba or whoever is the next prime minister will be approaching this issue. I think the biggest question really is the political stability of Japan at the moment. But going to your question about trilateral relations, I've spoken with lots of analysts and officials over the past few years about this, especially since South Korea took the first step to resolve the wartime laborers issue, I believe almost 2 years ago. But I believe that both things are true, that they made a lot of gains on trilateral, but at the same time, the arrangement remains fragile. And there's been a lot of focus on institutionalizing, but there's little that can't be undone by a president who wants to undo trilateral relationships at this point. And we saw during the first Trump term that trilateral was not on top of his mind. And in fact, it was during a time when South Korea and Japan relations were at a low point. And President Trump at the time basically said, it's their issue to resolve. Why should the US get involved? And he could end up taking a similar approach this time, or maybe his calculations will change because he will be focused on China and we'll see sort of this trilateral relations as a way to irk China or try to pressure China in a different way. But I think based on what we've seen in the first term, we don't see a lot of indications of hope that he would continue trilateral relations in the same way that Biden did. He can simply come in and decide not to participate in the new trilateral military drills, the Freedom Edge, which just happened again recently. He can simply decide that the leader level meeting that they all agreed to do once a year is just not something that he's interested in. He can decide to step away from all of it because it was a Biden legacy defining moment and not his own. So I do think that, a lot of these, the next steps on trilateral are very much a big question. And I do believe that the relation is fragile. The three countries, um, I believe, set up a secretariat and all that, but we know that those secretariats and these relationships can um, stall if there is no active effort to move it forward. Some analysts believe that there is enough going on in the background that can move without the involvement of the president. Some information sharing that's been happening on the defense and security side, that they believe that that'll continue. But I just don't know if we'll have another like banner Camp David moment as we saw under Biden anytime soon.
So, Michelle, as you have reflected or studied or heard about the issue of negotiations between Japan and North Korea, what is the latest figure that you have heard, the latest figure of compensation that North Korea would demand from the Japanese for any agreement to go forward, in addition to addressing the other points that you made?
Um, I I can't say I've heard a recent figure. The last time I had checked in on the latest negotiations with them was, I believe, like late last year or early this year. So I don't think I can share anything that's new and relevant enough. But I do know that once the the conversation sort of halted after particularly the abduction issue was taken off the table, that that was sort of the last time I heard, that there was any active conversation happening between the two sides about a summit.
All right, very good. So, Michelle, in the South Korean publication Haekyoreh, Professor Chung In-moon, formerly a top advisor to President Moon Jae-in, Professor Moon wrote, quote, South Korea has long held to a policy of unwavering loyalty to the U.S. But is that policy actually our best option? Do we have the wisdom and the courage to consider giving voice to our objections to the U.S., or even seeking an exit to the current arrangement? End of quote. Um, in terms of your work, again, your research, in your opinion, is the sentiment expressed by Chung In-moon, Professor Moon? Do you increasingly hear that when you're in Seoul?
I have consistently heard that, especially given that President Yoon came into office with barely a mandate. He won by something like 200,000 votes, the narrowest margin in South Korea's democratic history. And the opposition has maintained control of the National Assembly. The opposition has not shied away from expressing those concerns. President Yoon has very much hewed closely to the US and the Biden administration. They've been very much locking, step by step with many different issues. It has been to the discomfort of some in the business community who believe that a stronger, coming together between US and ROK, and especially against China, threatens their potential business opportunities. And it's also come at the discomfort of opposition leaders and the Democratic Party, that perhaps hewing this closely is not the best strategy for South Korea. And outlets like Hangyeongdae and other left-leaning outlets have consistently expressed that sentiment over the past few years that President Yoon has been in power. And, I think that's one of the things that is another potential question mark of how long President Yoon's, or we know that President Yoon is term limited, but who comes after him? I think there's a very much likely chance that a Democrat comes back into power, although at the moment it doesn't look like it could be Lee Jae-myung anytime soon. But I do think that sentiment has been there for, consistently. And some of those conversations have driven questions around whether South Korea should have its own nuclear weapons, especially during a second President Trump term. I've already seen debates about this resurface. the South Korean public broadly supports having nuclear weapons, although when it kind of comes to the details, there's not much polling to tell us how the public feels about potential economic impacts and all that. But it has already been coming back to the forefront, the debate over whether South Korea should take a greater stance to look out for its own security rather than leaning too much on the US.
All right. Let's turn to China for a moment. As you are fully aware, through time, recent years, long ago, American leaders have often said, China fixed the problem with North Korea, right? And American leaders of both parties will point to the degree of economic assistance that China provides to North Korea, which is major, and it varies in terms of quantity, types, and all that. But North Korea is dependent upon China. And so on the US side, there's a lack of willingness to accept or a lack of recognition that it's unlikely that China will really turn that screw, over an extended period of time. And can you break this down some? I mean, part of it is the fact that Americans, sometimes we don't recognize the historical connection, disagreements between China and North Korea. The fact, I'm sorry, you're a fact checker. I will say, in my opinion, the leaders of North Korea and China do not like each other. And while the United States, our number one priority has been denuclearization, with the Chinese, it's regional stability, right? And yet behind the scenes, I think they have done a lot on the North Korea front, which they're not going to talk about. But let me stop and hear what you have to say regarding this ongoing mantra that China should fix the problem.
I thought it was interesting that during the Biden Xi Jinping meeting this weekend in Peru, Xi Jinping said that China, quote, does not allow conflict and turmoil to happen on the Korean Peninsula. And there's a lot of question right now about what he really meant by that. Is he blaming the US rock Japan trilateral advancement? Is he really showing his annoyance with the North Koreans? There's a lot of analysts reading into that at the moment, and I guess we'll just have to see what it really means. But we do, based on the analysts I've spoken with, some diplomats, I know that this is the North Korea-Russia issue, for example, is something that is of keen interest in Beijing. And we saw China also take other steps recently, including rekindling relations with South Korea and Japan and having a summit this year for the first time in, I believe, 5 years. I guess my question at the moment would be, what can China do while Kim Jong-un is getting the support it needs and wants from Russia right now? Mm-hmm. What would Kim Jong-un turn to China for? Of course, cross-border trade has resumed since the COVID closures, but based on the economic estimates from South Korea, it's not resumed back to pre-COVID levels. I think Kim Jong-un's calculations certainly are slightly different when it comes to economic dependence on China at the moment because of the support from Russia, and because he's already shown during COVID that he's willing to and able to completely cut off, or almost completely cut off trade with China and survive for a time. And he's been boosting domestic production as a result of that and trying to decrease his dependence on China, which, as you know, has been something North Korea's wanted to do for a very long time. And although that, previous administrations, including Trump's first term, have leaned on China to try to direct DPRK one way or another, I do think that that's a fundamental misreading of Beijing's influence over North Korea and Kim Jong-un because of that history between the two countries. I've spoken with former North Korean diplomats who have expressed just how much the regime is skeptical of China and doesn't want to be dependent on China. And I just don't know that the same leverage points will exist now, especially given the relationship we see with Kim Jong-un and Putin.
On the China-US front, in the last 2 to 3 years, I've been amazed by the extent to which the Chinese are reaching out to the US on the Track 2 front, on the academic front, et cetera, specifically related to North Korea. How do you explain this? And by the way, as you prepare to respond, I would just remind our audience that if they have questions for Michelle, please submit those through the chat function. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think especially with President Biden at the helm, we've seen China go through periods of rapprochement, wanting to engage more with the US, and North Korea is probably a point that they could both agree on to a certain extent that, it's from China's perspective, it's a matter of regional security, like you said. For the US perspective, it's a matter of, deterrence and all that. And I'm not sure exactly what to make of China bringing up North Korea a lot in the Track 2 negotiations, but I do think that it is something that the two countries have at least publicly facing discussed and, talked about as a talking point. But I just don't know that indicates a fundamental alignment on the North Korea issue between Washington and Beijing.
Okay. And I'd like to clarify what I said earlier. Submit your questions through the Q&A function, please, the Q&A function. On the China front, again, Michelle, there are numerous bilateral issues between China and the United States, almost endless. And when it comes to North Korea, I'm fascinated that there now are very positive signals from China regarding cooperation with the US on matters related to US military remains from the Korean War. This is a positive. And so ultimately, one spends some time thinking through to what degree, under any administration, to what degree does the federal bureaucracy have the capability of sifting through areas where we can engage with China versus those areas where we have clear and stark differences. Is this a hopeless situation in your mind due to the size of our bureaucracy, due to the size of the Chinese government? What thoughts would you have on this?
Well, not being a China expert, I think the one thing that I am watching is the people that President Trump is looking to appoint into his cabinet and their approach to China. And, for example, Marco Rubio, I would say he has a very strong idea when it comes to China and countering China. And I don't know how much nuance has been built into his idea of engaging China versus not. So I think we have to see who's actually decided as those decision makers up top, and also how they change the structure of the federal bureaucracy. We do know that, for example, President Trump and, like Elon Musk and others believe that the federal bureaucracy is ballooned too much, and that could end up reconfiguring some of how our government functions, and how that affects the China team, how that affects the people who have been involved in these issues for a very long time and who could bring that historical perspective and nuance. I think that's another open-ended question with the second Trump term.
All right. Let's go to a different topic. As you're aware, the denuclearization of North Korea has been issue number one with the United States government through a range of administrations. You're also aware that there are other matters that are important to U.S. citizens related to North Korea. The divided families issue, which you earlier referenced. American POW MIA issues from the Korean War. A few thousand American military personnel were knowingly left behind at the end of that war. And it seems to me, one of the positives of the Singapore summit was the point of agreement between the US and North Korea to place greater focus on the Korean War POW MIA issues. And if my information is correct, which I believe that it is, supplied by DOD by way of Rick Downs with the Coalition of Families of Korean and Cold War POW MIAs, the remains of 250 individuals were returned to the United States after the Singapore summit. 162 of those are believed to be U.S. individuals. 93 have been identified. 69 are still pending. 88 individuals were determined to be Korean and were repatriated to South Korea. So there's a lot of discussion about this issue, POWs, MIAs, in terms of American POW and MIA issues. How is this issue of POW and MIAs from the Korean War, how is this issue viewed in South Korea? And I guess a question based upon your research, your reporting, have you come across any information suggesting whether or not North Korea and South Korea continue to have remains from the other country related to the Korean War? When I used to travel to North Korea for Senator Lugar, when he was chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I would take along a list of names of Americans missing. On 2 occasions, I called the South Korean embassy and said, would you like for me to raise this issue? And the answer is always no, don't go there. All right, that's fine. But in your mind, what have you come across on this issue in terms of South Korea and the North?
In terms of in South Korea, I can't say I've seen this as a major concern or an issue that's been brought up either from the government side or really like the civic organizations side, although perhaps I could have missed some efforts by the NGOs here. But I do know that, for example, the Unification Ministry is trying to bring more attention to issues like divided families, to issues like, wartime, like the remains issue. But I can't say it's really been on top of mind in the debate around North Korea, in South Korea. And broadly, even around divided families, I think it's very much been an issue that's been fading in the minds of South Koreans, and fading from the public dialogue around North Korea here in Seoul. For one, I think it's that some of these family members are very much elderly now. Some of them have died, and even the people who had been involved in the most recent divided families effort, like the reunification effort, many of them are not around anymore. And I think I know there's a lot of work being done to try to keep it alive, keep the issue alive, but I don't see it very much driving the public discussion in South Korea, especially under this current administration where there's not a whole lot of conversation about, ways to engage with North Korea. I think in terms of the POW remains recovery, that could be an opportunity under the second Trump administration. You mentioned the efforts around Singapore and after Singapore. Although the last time we reported on this, we had heard that after the Hanoi summit, there had not been efforts between US and North Korea over the recovery of the rest of the remains. That was the last we had heard, I think sometime late last year or so. So, that's my information is almost a year old now on this front, but I do see this as a potential potential issue that could come up again during a second Trump term. I mean, we've seen this as issue that the Trump first administration really pushed and had wanted to negotiate with the North Koreans over.
All right. Michelle, you may recall that following the death of Otto Warmbier, the State Department issued a ban on the use of U.S. passports to travel to North Korea. There are a few exceptions. If you are, I believe, a journalist, or if you are a humanitarian NGO, you may apply for what's called a special validation passport to travel. A few months ago, the State Department expanded the criteria to allow divided families, Americans who can attest that they have family in the North, that they as well could apply for a special validation passport. And so the Biden administration has been very open to that possibility. Of course, this ultimately gets back to North Korea, but I simply wanted to add that note. Let's talk about the challenge of doing your job in terms of information. So as a journalist, how do you evaluate the accuracy of information coming out of North Korea? Again, sometimes in the United States, little regard is given to the origin, the source of news or comments that come out of the North. Comments are sometimes simply labeled as all put in the same box, right? Well, the North Koreans say that, XYZ. But this is a problem because, as you know, there are multiple voices in the North. They do not always express agreement with what is stated. I've always been amazed by the fact that the North, as one example of, we have to be very careful. We have to sort through all of this. The North Koreans have repeatedly stated that the United States must cease hostilities on the Korean Peninsula. One example being the United States should remove its military from the South. Okay. Privately, we know that on more than one occasion, the North Koreans have said, now wait, we want your troops to stay. We want the U.S. military to remain as a balance to China. So it's a challenge for you, given the closed nature of North Korean society, the fact that they want as little information as possible coming out. How do you go about your job in terms of sorting out fact from fiction?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the North Korea story is possibly the biggest reporting challenge I faced since I began my career, and one of the most difficult stories a journalist could cover. In no small part because you don't really know if you're doing it right, if you're doing it accurately. Currently, I would say North Korea is the hardest country to cover on the planet for us journalists. You know, previously we used to be able to at least travel to the border region from the China side. Most of us major news outlets aren't allowed in China anymore with long-term visas. So we don't have a presence in the Chinese mainland. We could try to contact people in China through WeChat, but there's no way for us to do that with North Korea. And since the COVID border closures, it's become harder and harder to reach even sources in the border region area. So the little voices we used to be able to get are almost no longer there. And I think it's really to the detriment of the greater understanding of North Korea and of detriment to us who want to try to keep North Korea in the greater dialogue. We want to keep covering North Korea. We want to keep bringing new information about North Korea to the public. But if we don't have recent information, that's impossible. And one other source of information that's really dried up, or almost all sources of information have dried up, including NGOs who remained some contact, or defectors or escapees who used to come out directly from North Korea. There are so few now. So it is incredibly challenging. When I first started this job, I got a great piece of advice from another journalist who had covered North Korea for a long time, which was that reporting on North Korea is sort of like a constellation of information that you have to gather from different parts of the whole North Korea community, the watchers, the analysts, the activists, the officials, and that you have to gather information from as many different sources as possible while trying to understand where they're getting their information, and then try to cross-check the information to the best extent possible, and then work in caveats into your writing so that you're being clear to the readers that there's just no way for us to know exactly what's going on. There's no, formal statement in response to the reporting, etc. So I think, we just try to do our best to collect information from as many current and recent sources as we can. We, try to parse comments from North Korea as objectively as possible, talk to experts in North Korean media, as in experts who have studied North Korean state media for a long time and can give us context to those statements, can give us the history of how certain words have been used and what a shift in the wording could mean. And then try to just be as transparent to the public as possible about the limitations of our reporting. There are so many pieces of misinformation and easy fake stories that are done on North Korea that are very easily fact checkable. As a former fact checker, I have sorted through many different viral stories on North Korea that I could sort of parse through and realize this was actually fake news. Like, it just never existed, but then it's all over the news. And so it just kind of takes a lot of extra legwork in a way that other stories don't. But I think that it's incumbent on us as reporters in this region covering North Korea to go through that effort, because otherwise it's too easy to get it all wrong.
Yeah, the day is past when the journalists like Jean Lee could go into North Korea, open up the Associated Press Bureau, right? That's in the past. And
Yeah, I mean, it's I really envy those days when you could at least be accredited as a journalist, as a Western journalist to cover an event. I just don't know when Western journalists will be let back into the country, or if I will be in the region for that.
so as far as you know, what countries, journalists from what countries are now in North Korea? The Russians, obviously, uh, Russian journalists, Chinese journalists, others?
Um, Russian journalists for sure. I don't know how many Chinese journalists are there, but there are definitely journalists who are, in the border area who do a good job covering at least that region. North Korea recently accredited like some Japanese reporters to go in for like to cover one event. I think it might have been like the return of some of the Zainichi school groups who were able to bring in a Japanese journalist. When North Korea was accepting accreditation for a Japan-North Korea soccer match, a bunch of us applied, and they only accepted Japanese journalists and denied all Western journalists, denied South Korean journalists. So that was the first time that they had opened up for that sort of accreditation en masse. But then that game ended up being canceled, so we didn't have anything to cover anyway. But yeah, at the moment, it's just incredibly limited access.
So while you've covered this topic to a great extent, I would ask for aspiring journalists who have an interest in North Korea or the Korean Peninsula, what advice would you give them as they, in terms of education, in terms of experience, what advice would you give aspiring journalists who have a goal of eventually covering North Korea?
I would say have an open mind. Don't always fall into the conventional narrative around North Korea and conventional ideas about what, North Korea usually does or tends to do or wants to do. I think all of those things can be challenged and questioned and asked if it's still current. I think it's important for us to ask, like, are we making assumptions of North Korea based on what we think they want to do or what we've actually witnessed that they want to do? And I would say talk to a lot of people, expand the network around North Korea reporting as much as you can. Go beyond the usual sources, the usual people quoted in the news. Go find people who don't want to be quoted. Go find people whose names are never in the news but are very knowledgeable and connected. The last point I would say is just to read a lot of news coverage, read a lot of books, um, and journals and essays all on North Korea as much as you can, especially perspectives of people who have direct experience with North Koreans, and of course, perspectives of North Koreans themselves, escapees and families of escapees.
So, Michelle, if we could for a moment, before we close out, I'd like to go back to the larger issue of the United States, Northeast Asia, the future. To what degree, as you have connected with your sources in Seoul, Tokyo, elsewhere, to what degree is the United Nations mentioned as a possible point of reference or some or as a part of a resolution, meaning negotiations once again? You know, the Chinese sometimes say they'd like to return to the six-party talks. Others are now promoting a multilateral approach. Is there a role for the United Nations regarding reducing tensions on the peninsula and ultimately addressing those issues that matter to the United States and other countries?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if something like the six-party talks could be re-upped again anytime soon, but I do think a multilateral engagement approach is something that a lot of analysts look to, because even though North Korea has not been engaging with the US in the same way as before, we know they have maintained relations with other countries. We know they talk to the many countries in Europe, and many of the other diplomats who are at the UN and at Brussels. And so I think if we're talking about managing tensions, managing relations, going through these other countries that have maintained that relationship with North Korea, despite this current period that we're facing from the US, is definitely an option. We know that North Korea has, for example, been engaged in many climate talks through the UN. I think that is one area of engagement that could continue with North Koreans about climate and environment. We know that's an issue that they have constantly showed up to and wanted to talk about. So I think there is an opportunity to go through other channels that, perhaps are not immediately on our minds, that lean on other countries and diplomats of other countries who do maintain some sort of engagement with North Korea.
Finally, on the point, going back to the information issue again, we were talking about the lack of information coming out of North Korea. I've been fascinated through time to discover the extent to which North Koreans collect information about the United States. And they place a premium on US government publications. And there are certain publications that they read quite thoroughly. And where I think they have a challenge, however, is in their analysis of the information that they read. My point in sharing this is that whether it be what the North Koreans find online or through their army of 6,000 to 8,000 hackers, right? And their ongoing efforts to collect information through one means or another online, they are relentless. And now there is also a new effort underway by the North to collect books written by American authors on North Korean topics. So they're aggressive on that front, but we'll see what this means long term. Let me just finish here by saying that there are a lot of questions in terms of what is the future prospect for negotiations between the United States and North Korea. Prior to the election, we had a number of sources indicating that North Korea was awaiting the election outcome. The point of contact at the DPRK mission in New York with the United States used to be Ambassador Pak Sung-il. He was recalled to Pyongyang, as you're aware. His replacement is Counselor Jo Chang-chol. And reportedly, if relations improve between the US and DPRK, his title will change to that of ambassador. There are other reports we've heard in terms of what North Korea might do if relations improve, but we're not there. We'll just simply have to wait and see where all this ends up. Michelle, any final comments on your part?
Well, I just wanted to say thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that the next time we can have a webinar about how the US and North Korea has been engaging or new opportunities that have surfaced. So I'm hopeful for that.
Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate your taking the time. I want to again thank my colleagues, and I'd like to thank the audience for staying with us throughout this. So wherever you are, good evening, good morning, good day. And Michelle, once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.